All right, fellas. Last week we looked at the trials that Jesus had with Annas and then Caiaphas. And there are several things, teaching points from last week I want us to remember, key points. First is that the trials of Jesus before Annas and Caiaphas were illegitimate according to Jewish law. And there's a whole bunch of reasons you can pull out of the Jewish historic writings and law, whatever, but the clearest ones and the most specific are, first of all, they took place at night. You're not supposed to bring somebody charged of a capital offense to a trial at night. In fact, no trials were to be done at night. They were not to be conducted during the time of a religious festival, and we're right here in the middle of Passover. And they allowed no witnesses for the defense. They called no defense witnesses. It was all strictly accusations. The charges warranting death, typically in Jewish law, could not be tried in a single day. You had to give it time to be investigated and to filter out. And then finally, the most obvious, they went into it with a guilty verdict predetermined. But I do want us to understand and remind you that throughout all of these events, God was still in control. Mm-hmm. Okay? And we're going to continue to see that as the events unfold. And also that Jesus himself allowed the events of the night to take place because he was totally surrendered to the will of the Father. Remember, the power and authority he still commanded. You know, who is it that you seek? You know, Jesus of Nazareth. It is I. You know, it is me. And boom, you know, they all fall over. You know, and then he, you know, had to repeat it, and they were able to stand up, and he let them carry him away. So that's where we left off, and let's take a look at our reading today. And this comes from the three synoptic writers. MacArthur has pulled the three synoptic gospels together to form this collective set of passages here. And we're going to dive right in. Those who had laid hold of Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where all the chief priests, elders, and the scribes were assembled. Now the chief priests and all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree. But at last, two false witnesses came forward and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple of God made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands.' But not even then did their testimonies agree. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, 'Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?' But Jesus kept silent and answered nothing. And the high priest answered and said to him, 'I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?' Jesus said to him, 'It is as you said, I am. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven.' Then the high priest tore his clothes, saying, 'What further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy he has spoken. What do you think?' They all condemned him and said, 'He is deserving of death.' Then some began to spit in his face and to blindfold him and to beat him, and the officers struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, 'Prophesy to us, Christ, who is the one who struck you?'" So, picking up where we left off, looking at this record of what took place before Caiaphas, drawing from all three synoptic writers, we read again, those who had laid hold of Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes are assembled. Okay, remember, he was first brought before Annas after being arrested. We read that in John 8:12. Then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews. Please note that again. There were no Roman soldiers involved in this, okay? These were the captain and the officers of the Jews from the temple guard arrested Jesus and bound him. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now, we know the hour was around 3 a.m. based on Peter's first denial and the first rooster crowing. The rooster does not necessarily crow at sunrise. It's, earlier in the morning that they will be crowing in the middle of the night. So he's now dragged across the courtyard, or at the most a block away, and brought before Caiaphas, the Roman appointed high priest, who was Annas' son-in-law. Now, I want to restate one more time that my research, as I've continued to study this, even after having taught it previously, I'm continuing to review what I've study more things, and I will just tell you ahead of time, I'm jumping ahead about 2 lessons, but I'm going to tell you right now, I am personally believing that everything that took place, that we're studying right now, took place in one location, in one palace, if you will, or compound is a word I choose to use. After the lesson is over today, I'll pull up something to kind of give you a visual impression of the kind of Jewish estate or compound that very likely both high priests lived in with their families, separate from each other, across a huge courtyard, but probably within the same compound. Don't know for sure. Sadly, the tourist trade in the Middle East, particularly, in Jerusalem, Israel, is such that, and the times have been so, archaeological sites have been so corrupted by the first, second century churches, building churches on the sites of these, key places in Jerusalem, that it's just really, really hard to, be accurate about anything with respect to locations or buildings or whatever. It's sad that if you really go there with a sincere sense to see what Jesus saw, it's all changed. It's not right, and we do the best we can 2,000 years later to try to piece this all together. But we just have to understand that a lot has destroyed or corrupted, the original sites, and it's hard to pinpoint them in these days. Note from this scripture that it says all the chief priests and elders, the Sadducees and Pharisees, and the scribes, they were the scholars of the Jewish religious law, mostly Pharisees, were already assembled and waiting for Jesus to be brought to them. First, he's in Annas' residence, for a very short period of time, not long at all. He's going to be in Caiaphas' residence much longer, because he's going to be interrogated further. They're going to bring in witnesses, and they're going to condemn him. They're going to beat him. They're going to spit in his face and do all those things. None of that happened according to Scripture in front of Annas. So, since they were already waiting, there was a large crowd of these elders and chief priests. This affirms the depth of the conspiracy that has been developing probably for at least a year, if not 2 of his 3 years of ministry. And we're going to see additional preparation evidence for this conspiracy when Jesus is brought before the Sanhedrin. Now, I'm going to back off and not say it was the entire 70-member Sanhedrin. We're going to study that one, and I have some major changes from what typically we are taught traditionally, and what maps that, maybe even, ones I've given you that show the route that Jesus took on this night. I think all of that has been, fabricated by loose study and loose interpretation, and I'm going to do, I think, probably present an opinion about what took place that's going to, flip things upside down a little bit. But I don't want to get too far ahead. You have to wait for the next lesson to get to that. But continuing on at how MacArthur has put this together, he says, now the chief priests and all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Remember, he's in front of Caiaphas right now, not the official council. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree. So also gathered at this hour in the middle of the night were many false witnesses whose testimonies did not agree. This was probably because, first of all, they had been gathered up and prepared beforehand, but secondly, the reason their testimonies didn't agree is because they didn't have time, given the hurried attempt to put Jesus on trial that very night, that very hour. They didn't have time to corroborate together their testimonies. And the reality of it is that none of them had really heard, meaning understood, what Jesus had said. This was, and I'm going to say, is also a continuing problem even today. We had Matthew recording 8 times where Jesus said, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. In other words, it's not just a matter of listening to the words, but it's understanding what is being said. And not everybody was able to do that. 1 Corinthians in the New Testament, we have the warning, but the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness unto him. Neither can he know them, understand them, because they are spiritually discerned. So Jesus knew, even when he was teaching before masses of crowds, not everybody had an inclination to really be seeking God. They came to hear his words, but not really to understand or to apply them in his life. They had to be spiritually discerned. And my point is that God responds to those who are willing and open to hear spiritual truth, or to receive spiritual truth. But at last 2 false witnesses came forward and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard I will destroy this temple of God made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But even then, their testimonies did not agree. So the witnesses maliciously garbled and misrepresented Jesus' statements. Quite possibly they blended his figurative statement regarding his death and resurrection in John 2 with his prediction of a literal destruction of the temple as recorded in Mark 13. In John 2:19, Jesus answered and said to them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Then the Jews said, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days? But, John writes, he was speaking of the temple of his body. John clarifies the understanding. Therefore, when he said he had risen from the dead, his disciples remembered what he had said, that he had said this to them, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said. And then in Mark, remember, they went out of the temple, and as they went out, one of the disciples turned and said to him, teacher, see what manner of stones and what what great buildings are here. And Jesus answered and said to him, do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. And of course that was fulfilled, 70 years later when the Romans came and destroyed Jerusalem. But their charge claimed he was disloyal to the present order of religion and worship by replacing the temple, and that he was blaspheming God by saying he would so quickly rebuild the temple without hands. Total misunderstanding, but even then, their two statements, they could not agree. And the high priest stood up, now this is Caiaphas, in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you? But Jesus kept silent and answered nothing. He kept to the character of the Messiah as was prophesied in Scripture in Isaiah, where the Messiah was oppressed and afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shears is silent, so he opened not his mouth. And getting fed up with this, the high priest answered and said to him, I put you under oath. In many translations, I adjure you by the living God, which means to put under oath. Tell us, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? In the Jewish culture, to be adjured, put under oath by the high priest to the living God, was the most sacred oath a Jew could utter. He was saying, in effect, answer my question truthfully on the basis that you are standing before the living God who knows all things. This basically amounted to the high priest, who was charged to stand before God as God's assigned representative of the people, to direct a person to speak an oath or make a vow before God as if God were standing right there. That is what the high priest is supposed to do in that capacity. And I've mentioned this before to you guys a number of times. Ministers who perform weddings today are basically doing the same thing. That's why I do very few weddings, and I've explained that to you before, because I'm coming before holy God to bring a couple together before holy God to make a holy oath to God. And if they are not sincere, if they are in direct, by their personal behavior, in rebellion against God, if they're not believers, if they're not walking and living in purity and sanctification toward God, I'm not going to stand before God, bring them before God, and make an unholy oath, an unsincere oath. I just will not do it as a minister. Woe to those who pretend to represent God, who do so knowing that the couple's vows are not sincere. That's my problem, okay? Made while they have been or are still openly rebelling against God with respect to moral purity, and woe to those who make such sincere vows. Personally, I want no part of that. Jesus said to him, it is as you said, and the great words, I am. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven. So Jesus not only answered in the affirmative that he was the Christ, he also inserted the unmistakable assertion that he was God by using the phrase, God's holy name, I am. He further referred to himself as the Son of Man, another Jewish term for the Messiah, whom he said they would see taking his rightful place at the right hand of the power. The Greek there is tos dunamis, and we get the word dynamite from dunamon, dunamos, which is the noun word. And it's a clear reference to God Almighty, along with a reference to his second coming when he said they would see him again coming on the clouds of heaven. At that point, the high priest tore his clothes, saying, "What further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard him, or you have heard the blasphemy. He has spoken." And he said, "What do you think?" Talking to all of the elders that had gathered. They all condemned him and said, "He is deserving of death." Apoplectic with their hostility, the high priest rends his clothes and shouts blasphemy. The others join the chorus, and the momentum of an emotional mob reaction begins, and they all call for Jesus to be executed. Then some began to spit in his face, and to blindfold him, and to beat him. As if calling for his death was not enough, these chief priests and the elders now begin, that's a typo in your notes there, now begin to spit in Jesus' face and to physically assault him. And this is a reference back to Isaiah's prophecy. "I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who plucked out the beard. I did not hide my face from shame and spitting." And the officers struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, "Prophesy to us, Christ, who is the one who struck you?" Now the officers here, meaning the leaders of the temple guard, began to slap him hard and challenge him to identify by name those who were striking him. Those who brought Jesus bound before the council now blindfold him and begin to beat him. Remember, they were armed with clubs. All right, so that's the passage we're looking at. And it kind of ends abruptly, because the next thing we're going to turn to in the next lesson are going to be the denials of Peter. It's going to be a comprehensive lesson on the 3 denials. Let me give you a little foretaste of where I'm headed in this, or what I think we're going to discover when we do the deep dive, and I'll show you the receipts for this. I want you to picture this elaborate compound that the 2 chief priests probably were living in together, one across the other from this huge courtyard. In the middle of the courtyard were gathered just the stragglers of the mob that went to capture Jesus. The ones that went in before Annas and Caiaphas would have been from the temple guard, and any of the chief priests that might have been with him. We don't know for sure. We'll discuss this when we get to this in our next lesson about the denials. But Peter is let into the compound by a disciple of Jesus who is known by the high priest, either Annas or Caiaphas. And that's when Peter came in. And it was when he was in the compound that all of this was going on. And I'm believing that both chief high priests were probably in the same compound, separated by the courtyard. During the time of these 2 trials, before the council was brought, and I'll show you also the subsequent lesson that the council could not have met in the temple, and I'll give you the historic reasons why. The Romans had taken away their council room in the temple and had forbade them 2 years earlier to meet as a council in the chamber of hewn stone, which is where the Sanhedrin typically met. They were told they had to meet under the tents, meaning outside wherever you could. Okay. And I'll show you that when we get to that lesson. So just jumping ahead, but I want your heads to be thinking about this. My sense is, you know, Peter was led into the courtyard as Jesus was led to Annas. One of two things happened during his 3 denials. They were all in the courtyard. Okay? No other place. All took place in the courtyard. All 3 denials. And when the third one took place, remember, Jesus turned and looked at him, and their eyes met. So Jesus had to be in the courtyard. And the only way that could have happened is if, you know, Peter had the 3 denials when he was with Annas, and I don't think that happened because the scripture said after about an hour he was taken, you know, to Caiaphas. After about an hour he was taken to the council, so he was with Caiaphas for about an hour. Annas, I don't see him being there that long, but either when he was being transported from Annas across the courtyard to Caiaphas' residence, he had his 3rd denial, which I don't think he did because you know, the scriptures indicate it would have been after a longer period of time. I think what happened is he was taken into Annas, and after a short period, a short interrogation, he was, you know, taken to Caiaphas, which was the high priest according to the law, the Roman, you know, structure at that point. And then after he was abused and spit upon, and the false witness had come in, and while they're waiting for the council to come to meet, and I'm going to show you, they could not have met in the temple. Okay, they probably came to Caiaphas' residence. Some of them, a good number of them, were already there. Okay, so they had to assemble, not all 70 or 71. They had to assemble a quorum, and a quorum was 23. So as these others, either full council or at least a minimum quorum, were being assembled and gathered, Jesus was brought out of Caiaphas' residence to wait in the courtyard before they were all assembled. And I think that is when their eyes met, Peter and Jesus' eyes met, and the rooster crowed. It could have also been after he came out of the 3rd trial with the council, which we haven't gotten to yet, and on his way to be taken to the praetorium. But the scriptures also say that Peter wept bitterly and left the courtyard, you know, when their eyes met at that point. I personally tend to think he went before Annas, was taken to Caiaphas in the same compound, was brought out of Caiaphas' residence while the rest of the council was being assembled and they were getting organized to do their thing. And he's waiting outside in the courtyard, surrounded by the guards. Peter and his eyes meet, and then Peter leaves and departs early from that. This is what I think we're going to see transpire. You may do research before we continue to, you know, to meet and study and come up with another conclusion. But I've discovered the more I look into this, the more I see that our church traditions have painted a picture that is not entirely true. Again, it's 80% observation, which means you're studying everything. The history, the geography, the socio, economic, political, you know, religious, geographic, linguistic, all of the things that took place 2,000 years ago. And you understand that and have studied it to get a clear interpretation, which then allows you to have a clear application. But we will see. And I'm not saying I've got it down right, 100%. But I'm amazed, after all the formal education study I've done, how much my traditional picture in my mind of what took place that night has changed. And you will have to grapple with it for yourselves when we get there. Okay? The thoughts, questions, comments about anything we looked at here today? All right. Now, let's take a look at our application as Jesus is brought before Caiaphas. So let's look at the conspirators. Remember, he's now involved in this conspiracy. He's being brought to fruition. So after taking Jesus to Annas, his abductors bring him before Caiaphas, where all, it says, the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes had assembled early in the morning, probably sometime, around 3 a.m. The scriptures read, those who laid hold of Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where all the chief priests, elders, and scribes were assembled. Now, Mark clearly says all. I think there is a question if he means every single chief priest was there, every single elder was there, or all the scribes, which would have been the Pharisees, had assembled. I think that's a bit of a literary device, just saying, there was a load of them there. I don't think you could have gotten all of them assembled there. So I think we have to take all with a little bit of grain of salt here. It means that, they all may be in this conspiracy. That's probably a better way to understanding that all of those that were involved in the conspiracy surely were gathered. Those who were not involved, were not. But it's important to see that it's spread. I mean, it's a very inclusive conspiracy. They actively sought false witnesses. They weren't looking for truth. False witnesses with no regard for truth. They sought false testimony against Jesus. They didn't want true testimony. They wanted testimony that met their
agenda.
Yeah, fit their agenda. Thank you. I couldn't find the word.
You wonder where their consciences are.
I don't think they had much at that point. Despite their aggressive search, they could not find any false witnesses whose testimonies agreed. Isn't that interesting? For many bore false witnesses.
We must see.
Yeah.
See.
We jumped.
Oh, I jumped one. Excuse me. They predetermined to have Jesus sentenced to death. I mean, when they gathered that night, sentencing him to death was the objective. Despite their aggressive search, they could not find false witnesses whose testimonies agreed. Finally, 2 witnesses were found who declared Jesus said he would destroy and rebuild the temple. But even their testimonies did not agree. After a charge of blasphemy from the high priest, notice what happens next. They become violent and abusive. Let me stop and make a caveat here. Again, these things are intended to be application. I mean, we should be able to look around at the world and judge for ourselves if these things are still not happening today. And I'm saying they do. When you have particularly, let's just, I don't mean to pick on any particular religion, but I will point out the Islamic religion, that if you do not agree with their understanding of Muhammad, Allah, or the Al-Quran, you know, it is all blasphemy and you are worthy of death. There is no discussion. And that is why when somebody, you know, says they have come to trust Christ, in the mind of Muslims in the Middle East, is that means you have denied God, Allah, you have denied the Prophet, Muhammad, you've denied your birthright, your family, your heritage, and you are worthy of death. Legally, you know, in the Middle East countries, you know, that I've served in, legally you can lose everything. You lose your house, your marriage is annulled, you don't have a relationship with any of your family, you lose your kids, you lose your car, you lose your job, and you are very lucky if you don't lose your life. Generally speaking, the Muslims I've worked with who have come to Christ have had to leave countries. And I've had to help them do that, to escape, because they're being sought after by the Mukhabarat, the secret police, where they would have been incarcerated, and probably, if let go, the family would have killed them. In fact, you know, read a weekly, you know, newspaper, you know, where I lived, that was published in English. They had a whole section on, you could see every week there were a number of honor killings, you know, listed in a particular section of this newspaper. So it was okay. I mean, if you killed your daughter, you killed your son because they came to Christ, you know, you'd be hauled before the law and go to a trial, and, you know, you might be sentenced for a short period of time in jail or prison, 6 months at the most, and then released, just a slap on the hand, because after all, it was for the honor of Allah, honor for the family. Blasphemy, they become violent and abusive. The high priest, Caiaphas, he was falsely enraged by the false charges against Jesus. Feigned rage. He said, "Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?" And after Jesus affirmed he was the Christ, the Son of the Blessed, the high priest ripped his clothes and stirred those assembled with the charge of blasphemy. That's all he had to do to stir up the crowd, was to shout blasphemy. The Lord declared that he was the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, God himself, when he said, "I am." And again, I want us to understand, he allowed the conspirators to beat him, abuse him, and to spit in his face. Any comments or personal insights, observations, questions?
So none of this up to this point involves any of the Romans at all, right?
Not in my opinion.
Yeah.
I can see, the scripture doesn't support it. Where people would claim that is strictly limited study and observation. And like I pointed out, the NASB translation of 95, inserts Roman cohort, but those words are not there. It's just a crowd of soldiers, the Greek word, I don't remember what it is right now. But, our traditions and our imaginations have gotten in the way across 2,000 years of church tradition and history with true understanding of what it was like back then and what was taking place. It's just, I cannot accept, given my study of history and the relationship of the Romans and the Jews at that time, that Caiaphas would ever have been given any Roman soldiers, to do what he wanted.
Mm-hmm.
That's just too beneath the Romans to do to the Jews, especially the religious leaders who Pilate despised. They had their guard. They had the temple guard. They were lightly armored and outfitted with weapons, but they were limited on controlling the people in the temple for religious reasons. The Romans let them do that, so the Romans didn't have to. And Caiaphas knew, that he had to use his troops expeditiously to stay out of trouble with Rome. But those are my thoughts. I don't claim to be perfect on any of this, but I'm just being as transparent as I can. This is where I've come to believe, in my mind, things took place as I continue to study not just the scriptures, the parallel columned, four-columned, parallel studies, but what MacArthur has done, and doing a deep dive into, the linguistics and the history. I'm just getting a totally different perspective and how it probably went down. And I've given you a couple of maps, just to have in there for perspective, and that's good. But where it shows, going to Annas' house and then being carried over to Caiaphas' house and then being carried into the temple through the council of the Sanhedrin, and then to the Praetorium. I'm of opinion right now, it did not happen that way.
I was given thought about Peter, because a lot of times we can apply Peter and the things that he does and has done and apply it in our life sometimes, our reactions, when Peter, when Jesus met him out in the storm and Peter was in the boat and come to walk in the water, Peter lost focus and started looking horizontally. He started sinking, and I play out this in the garden when Jesus was there and the power of his presence was there, and they come after him, and the whole gang of them, and he says, "I am," and they
fall down.
and Peter's right there, and then when
Malchus.
and Peter draws his sword and he's all then following into the courtyard there and
And getting humbled very quick.
very quickly. His eyes looking at Jesus, but he looks at a seemingly powerless Jesus, you know, and starts looking horizontally again.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. I mean, we're going to get to Peter next time we meet, and a lot of the applications are going to be dealing with, you know, how we react when we're fearful or challenged or intimidated, or, you know. But just you brought up something really good, I think, Ann, in that consider the crowd coming at Jesus, and you know, they're saying, you know, who is Jesus? Where is Jesus? And he says, I am, and they all fall down. And Peter's with him with a sword. The crowd gets back up, and they come at him again. So what was going on? I don't know. This is stimulating, you know, some interesting thought here. What was going on in Peter's mind and heart at that point when he drew this sword? Did he draw it in fear and trying to protect Jesus, or did he draw it because Jesus is the Messiah? He spoke a word and they fell flat on their face.
He's here to set the kingdom up.
Yeah.
So let's take it.
Exactly.
Right, and he said, you know, let's go, guys. Let's help Jesus build the kingdom. You know, I mean,
Here we go.
was that part of it? You know,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
Jesus is right here. He spoke just like he spoke a word, and the storm stopped. You know, was that part of that his action then that caused him to swing his sword? I don't know, but it brings an interesting thought. And then later, when he's in the courtyard, you know, and a little servant girl says, weren't you with one of them? You know, I don't know the man. you know, and that's going to be, you know, next time we meet, we're going to be studying those three denials, and that's going to be an interesting study, because this is, in the practical application of that, is how do we react
Yes.
when people point the finger at us and say, you one of them? You know, they point the finger at us and said, you were with him. You know, one of the accusers was a relative of Malchus who had his ear cut off. Okay, so he's pointing the finger at Peter and saying, weren't you there? And look what's happening there. How historical bad actions of Christianity have become a point of accusation for being a Christian. Crusades, for example, okay? Certainly not, you know, godly in any sense, and were terrible times, okay? But the bad history of Christianity is used against Christians today, and we can see that playing out. And it played out with Peter. You know, aren't you the guy that swung the sword? You know, you're one of them. You know,
Sure.
and look what it does. You know, I mean, it terrifies him, and he crumbles at that point. So we have to examine ourselves and say, look, okay, there's been times in the history of Christianity. Not all Christians, not all preachers, not all pastors, not all churches have done everything they should have done correctly. But that doesn't stop us from, you know, loving and following, you know, the Lord. And that is what makes a genuine Christian. That's what makes a genuine follower of Christ. That he loves the Lord, his God, with all his heart, mind, soul, and strength, and he loves others as himself.
He gets knocked down, he stands up and does it again.
Yeah.
Gets knocked down, stands up, does it again. This whole scenario about Jesus being on trial here, to me, could be coming back at us, like it did with Stephen. That we have this counsel against us. How are we going to respond at that time?
This is the whole point of our application here. Looking at what took place with
Yes.
him, You know, we are to look around at the world and look at our own lives and our own situation, and are we ready to deal with it? You know, it's a challenge. I mean, I've designed this to be a challenge to my own heart. When I put this on paper, in the computer, whatever, it's not just for, you know, putting it on in the computer. It's, I'm challenging myself, you know, when I come up with these, you know, points, you know. If I'm being falsely accused, you know, being accused of blasphemy, to the point of death, what is my reaction going to be? Is it going to be like Christ? Am I going to fold and crumble? I'm going to try to run and hide, or maybe like Peter, deny? All of those things, you know, are intended for personal examination, beginning with me.
That's where it starts. Yes.
Reminds me of the old adage, if you were on trial for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you?
Good one, yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. Exactly. Okay, anything else? We're good? All right, guys.